time now to turn our attention to the business world. European Union leaders consider ramping up sanctions against Russia. Now they're talking about banning coal imports, but can they handle the pain of higher energy prices? Meanwhile, the US makes it harder for Russia to repay its debts, and inflation across the developed world smashed through a 30-year high in February. That's before Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, here to discuss these stories is Arise business correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie. The EU is expected to adopt more restrictions on Russia's fossil fuels on Wednesday. What are you hearing about that?
Well, it looks like everything is concentrated on coal. And Charles, since this thing started, we have been talking about, will the EU take the step of banning what it really values from Russia, and that's the import of gas. They're sort of edging around it a little bit. They've talked about perhaps not taking Russian gas, not taking Russian oil. They're still talking about that, but they are looking at banning Russian coal. Now, we think of coal as being a very small part of the energy mix, but in fact, over the past year or so, coal has become much, much more expensive because gas has increased so much in price. And European nations are no longer digging this out of the ground themselves, but they're taking it from Russia, where environmental standards are a little bit less stringent. So coal has become a bigger part of the energy mix over the past year. So if this ban comes into effect, and there are some questions as to whether it will, it is going to hurt. Coal about 15% of the energy mix last year, but probably north of 20 at this point. But here's the thing, Charles. Will this be approved? This has to be approved by all 27 members of the EU.
That's the big challenge.
That's the big challenge. We know that Viktor Orban, the new leader of Hungary, well, the re-elected leader of Hungary, is a bit of an admirer of Vladimir Putin. Hungary also very reliant on Russian coal. Will this get that unanimous approval? It looks unlikely at this point.
And of course, this would be a fifth round of EU sanctions targeting President Putin's regime. The difficulty, as you said, with this fifth round is the lack of agreement, because energy is a stumbling block, isn't it?
Absolutely. We mentioned Hungary, but Germany is sort of dragging its feet as well, because Germany is so reliant on Russian fossil fuels for heating. And I think a lot of people thinking in Germany about how dependent they have become on Russia. But of course, you can't disentangle those ties overnight or over a week or even a month. So Germany is trying to say the right things, but when it comes down to it, does Germany really want to take the hit? That is a very big question right now. The feeling in the markets right now, Charles, is that we are sort of running out of things to sanction. Each round of sanctions is having a slightly less of an effect, less of an unsettling effect on the financial markets. Coal prices up today quite a bit, 7%. That's usually a big move, but we were seeing so much more volatility in crude oil prices when sanctions were being threatened.
So, I mean, what's the extent of European reliance on Russian oil and gas? I know you've talked about this before, but different countries with different degrees of reliance.
And you've got that point. In general, Russian gas is about 40% of the energy mix across the EU, but it varies so very wildly, which is why you have these differing opinions in the EU. Germany is looking at about 50% of its electricity mix from Russia. Remember, Germany took most of its nuclear power offline. France doesn't import very much at all because nuclear power is such a big part of the mix in France. And so it's very difficult to get any kind of agreement here. The other thing that's part of this package is a ban on transport of any sort, well, almost any sort. Russian trucks can no longer come into the EU if this passes. Russian ships will not be able to dock at EU ports. But again, can you get agreement on that? And even if there is agreement, anything carrying fossil fuels has been exempted from the ban that they're discussing tomorrow.
Absolutely. Let's try and get through two other very interesting topics. The US makes it harder for Russia to repay its debts.
And this is a little bit complicated. So America has said Russia cannot pay its interest payments in dollars. Basically, it can't go through any US-based banks to get those dollars out to debtors. So prior to now, you and I have discussed, whether Russia would be able to make those debt payments. They have made their debt payments so far, but there are 2 U.S. banks along the path that take these funds, pass them along, and then they're dispersed to people who lend to Russia. The U.S. is now saying, we are not going to allow that to happen. Now, there was a briefing from the Treasury late yesterday, the U.S. Treasury late yesterday, and it was a little bit convoluted because the Treasury was saying, well, this will force Russia to run down its reserves. But that's sort of counterintuitive. If Russia's not paying these debt payments, well, they're not running down their reserves. They're in fact conserving reserves. It means they may default on their debt, and that becomes problematic down the road. But not paying their debt payments does free up money for other sorts of nefarious things.
And of course, you were talking about energy crunch, the energy challenge, and all these things are related because we're just about to talk about inflation across the developed world, which has gone through a sort of 30-year high.
We're at a 30-year high at the end of February, Charles. These are aggregate numbers from what's called the OECD. It's a loose grouping of fairly developed nations, up 7.7% on an annual rate in February, 30-year high, as you mentioned, but that was before most of what happened in Ukraine. That was before these big rises we're seeing in energy prices. And what stuck out in these OECD numbers is the price of food. Food prices were a big portion of that rise. And that hasn't even started. The pain is still yet to come on that.
Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Always very interesting talking to you. I wanted to talk to you actually about Lithuania ending imports of Russian gas. And why can't Germany? We've got 10 seconds.
Lithuania is one of the bravest nations in the EU right now, isn't it? But it comes down to Lithuania is not that reliant on it. It's a small
That's the
country.
point I wanted you to make. Laurie, thank you very much indeed.